All right, so let me share and kind of actually, no, we're going to start a little differently. Um, yeah, so let me just give you an overview of like what we're going to go through. Like we're going to follow the lesson pretty closely, but a lot of the lesson is like defining syntax basically and giving you examples of syntax. So we're not going to spend like a ton of time on that. We're going to spend like kind of some time highlighting like some important parts of like what JavaScript is doing and how it's doing it. And then I think the best way to learn anything, especially new, is kind of like to jump in. So we'll have like two small code challenges that we're going to try to implement in JavaScript. Cool. No one looked scared. So good. And yeah, I'd love to kind of start off with just hearing from y'all. What have you heard about JavaScript? What do you know about JavaScript? What is JavaScript? Anything that y'all have in your mind so far to maybe kick us off? Do you have opinions about JavaScript? Who knows? Yeah, go ahead, Joey.
Without very much experience myself, I've heard it is a little harder to test than Ruby and is less clear when things go wrong.
Cool. As someone who tested JavaScript in Angular a long time ago, I will say it is a bit harder to test, but I would disagree with harder to figure out what's going wrong. I would say it's about the same. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
So for me, one of the hardest things about, well, not the hardest, but like about Ruby, understanding that everything in Ruby is an object. And then I've been reading that like in JavaScript, something could be like you can do object oriented programming or you can do functional programming. So I think it's going to take me a little while to even like separate those two.
Yeah, that's a good. That's like one of the higher level things that I actually wanted to talk about a little bit in the lesson, so we can kind of jump into that. Yeah, so the things that Ryan said, just to repeat, JavaScript can be object oriented and it could also be written functionally. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about functional programming. Know that it is like its own paradigm. Like OOP is kind of like its own paradigm, and JavaScript is flexible enough to kind of write it that way or the OOP way that where you define a class and we pass around objects and they're in control of their their state and their behavior. The idea with functional programming is you just have inputs and outputs, right? Like everything's a function, and everything functions can call other functions, and really the only thing that like we're worried about is defining like clear inputs and outputs for each function is the idea there. I'm not like a I'm probably a what you would call a simpleton when it comes to functional programming because I haven't used it really at all. I've read about it and like I understand the basic high level parts of it, but like it's a totally different thing. And like there are like large books written about it. So know that we're not going to get into that because we follow the OOP pattern, but know that JavaScript is one of those languages flexible enough for both. Um, cool. What else? What else do y'all know that, or what? Any other opinions? Have you heard anything from front end? I mean, I'll give you an opinion. I think there's like way too many like uh, parentheses and curly brackets in JavaScript. That's an opinion. Let's see. Okay. No one has anything else they want to say?
I mean, I know it makes prettier things when you write it in JavaScript usually than in Ruby, potentially.
Say more about prettier things.
It's more interactive and more flexible in creating like displays and things like that, or generally is used as a more common language for that.
Gotcha. So we're saying like it makes for more pretty or useful web interfaces.
A better user experience.
All right. I can, you know what? I'm gonna say I agree with that. It's built for that. Go ahead, Harrison.
I know you can do like more dynamic stuff without like reloading the page with JavaScript, unlike Ruby, where if you want something to change, you kind of have to reload the page or re-render it. You can
Yeah.
like scroll over stuff or click something and make like an animation happen.
Yep. So you have to think like we can kind of like use JavaScript to circumvent or really just avoid completely the request response cycle because it runs right there in the browser. So that's like another great thing about JavaScript is like if you're in the browser, you've got the page already loaded up, you can use your JavaScript assets to respond to, you know, a myriad of user events that are taking place without ever having to like worry about going back to the server, and that is like highly ideal in a performance concept or context. So yep. And okay, I think that's enough to get us started. Let's share. Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, so we are going to hit all these learning goals because basically you're going to need to like do them all in the challenge, like the challenges that we're going to do. So, but we're not going to spend a ton of time like, hey, this is how you declare a variable. This is how you declare a function and pass it parameters. Like all of that stuff's in this lesson, but like you don't need to hear me talk about it because y'all are capable of like kind of looking at that and I think understanding what's going on there. But yeah, so JavaScript, kind of a funny history. Like when it was made, the popular language then and today is Java. And, you know, the idea of naming it JavaScript was so that it would hopefully get picked up by Sun Microsystems, which was like one of the big players back in the 90s. And instead, we just have the inevitable confusion of two things that begin with the word Java, two very, very separate and different languages. Yep, this is what happens when you don't have clearly defined conventions like REST or like HTML, like clearly defined, right? Um, anyways, so we already talked a little bit about what JavaScript is, but I want to be clear, like, yes, it is built and was built to like run in the browser. And it is like a JavaScript engine powers all of our modern browsers. So Chrome, Safari, uh, Internet Explorer, Firefox, they all like are powered by JavaScript. But like you can also write server-side applications in JavaScript, and I think Node is probably the most popular server-side JavaScript framework. Yeah, and it's the most common. What I like to tell backend developers is like you can't avoid it. Like as much as you've been able to avoid it so far in your journey here at Turing, when you get out there in the world, it's just unavoidable. It's everywhere, and like that's okay. I think like you can't really tame it, but you have to be at least familiar with it because it's going to be part of your life. What do I want to say? Yeah, I used to look at JavaScript as like, you know, maybe a negative connotation, and now I look at it as like anything else. It's a tool to use a job to it's a tool that does a lot of different jobs and does some jobs really well, such as run single page applications in your browser that allow for a user to have a rich like web experience and a rich interface and like be very performant. That is what I think, or my opinion of like the best thing JavaScript does. And it also confuses backend developers. So you can look forward to that too. Okay, so yeah, basic data types. I think like the thing to remember here is like these data types are going to be, every language is going to have a little bit like of nuance in the types of data types that you have. And just like know that that is a thing. So the numeric data type basically covers integers and floats in the JavaScript language. We have strings, we have Booleans, you're familiar with those. Yeah, there's this like basically this difference between ES5 and ES6. So most browsers that you have now are like on ES6, but ES5, it's basically like there's a difference in syntax. And I would say like the biggest thing that you had to get used to with ES6 was a different way to write functions. And basically everyone went to arrow functions is like, I mean, there's probably a lot more to it than that, but that's the biggest thing that like affected my life on the job when this happened, because this happened like when I was on the job and I was like, now we're just all writing functions differently. Like, all right, like that's fine. But like once you get used to it, it's a little bit better. So anyways, know that there's like a difference between like the syntax between ES5 and ES6, and that's some places will be on, some places will use the ES5 syntax, some like companies, and some will use ES6. It's kind of like different, versions of Ruby, and yeah, just be aware of that. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, I watched a YouTube video on JavaScript yesterday, and the guy was referring to two things that I wasn't 100% certain on. One was DOM, the word DOM, and I don't see it in this lesson plan, so that's why I'm asking. And then the other thing is you saying the word markup, and is that just shorthand slang for if I say I'm writing markup, does that mean I'm writing HTML?
Yes,
Okay.
essentially for that one. And then the DOM is the document object model, and it is not in this lesson. Fun. It's essentially, if I open up the dev tools, like it's the way that like our browser kind of like makes an object oriented tree of every single element on the page. So like essentially, where the heck is it? It's not in the styles. Oh, I think I'm just like hiding it. Yeah. There we go. So like this is the DOM. It's like everything basically. This is the document object model, and it's like all of like your HTML tags, and it's really the tree of the page that you're viewing is essentially what it is. And yeah, there's a lot more to it than that, but we're staying high level at this point. Cool. Yeah, and so if I wanted to, I wonder if I can do this. I don't have any line numbers here. Yeah, because I'm not looking at any JS file. Wonder if we have any assets. No, we don't. This is a static website. It's our website, so no. So never mind. We're not going to look at anything that we're not going to look at any JavaScript files here in this specific web page, but I might show you one at the end of the lesson. I'll just have to like find an example. Okay, cool. What else do we want to say? Yeah, let me get rid of this. Okay, so I think we'll actually do this part. So yeah, let's talk about these functions. Essentially, you can define a function by saying like function, and then like whatever your name is, and then you define it with these arrows or these parentheses. We don't have the arrow function syntax in here because it's kind of confusing to be honest, like to start. So we kind of just start with this, like, I think more straightforward syntax. And then you can like define a function as a constant, and I lied because here's the arrow syntax. And basically say if you know that that function is never going to change, if you're like, I know that I never need to like change this function later on down the line, you can define it as a constant, which is essentially what's happening here in this second one. And then this is like the arrow syntax. You see, it doesn't like make that much. I mean, I guess it's fine, but yeah, it's takes a little getting used to. I'd say like you screw it up quite a bit when you're first defining them, and this is just like a little bit easier, in my opinion, to like start with your definitions. Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, and then like the big thing to remember is functions always have parentheses, even if you're not passing them any parameters. But if the function was gonna take, if you were gonna define parameters here and pass it arguments, then you would define it right here. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. What exactly is this const tag?
Yeah, that's kind of like you're defining this function as a constant, not exactly the same type of constant that we've had in Ruby, if you've like seen those. But the idea here is like, hey, this function is not going to change, and you basically like signal that this function will never change with the const. So that's kind of like the signal of like, hey, this could never change. Whereas if you're defining it like this, then like maybe later on down like the line in the JavaScript file, like you actually define, or you have the ability to redefine what myrad function does. Whereas if you defined it as the const with the constant syntax, you would get an error because it'd be like, no, you can't like redefine this function. You already defined it as a constant above. That's essentially the difference.
Okay, so for the first one, if I made another function or variable called myrad function, then that would that would override this one.
Correct.
But for the second one, I can't. It would give me an error.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, let's go to Mike.
So just to piggyback off that question, is the const kind of like putting a method under a private block or like a private wall?
Not exactly. It's just like a different way to define both like a variable and a function that can't change, basically. It's like your way of saying like, hey, this cannot change after this definition. Whereas if you defined it differently, then you can change it after. All right. Yeah, I think, yeah, the way you would call it is like after you define it somewhere below, then you just kind of like, hey, whatever you called it, plus parentheses to call it. Yeah. Cool. All right. Yeah. And this is, I think, like the best way to do this. We're going to do this your turn. Like the other thing to like, that's pretty cool about JavaScript is like, since it just runs in the browser, you have this JavaScript console here. So like I can do whatever I want here in JavaScript and it just runs. So if I wanted to define like a function called hello world and like this, and I wanted to say something like alert, I'm learning JavaScript. Great. Two things about it. I need this, basically these curly brackets define like, hey, what happens within this function? And then everything before it is generally like, hey, we're defining this and here's the name of it. And here's this like parentheses syntax to like indicate this is a function. And then once I close this bracket, that's the end of like the scope of the function. Cool. And when I define it, you see this like undefined. So like it's kind of like similar to like Ruby, like everything has a return value. So like the return value of defining a function is undefined. But then if I do a hello world here, not what I expected. You know why? Is because I didn't call it correctly. So I just said hello world and it says, hey, yeah, there is something called hello world. It's this function here and here's how it's defined. But I didn't invoke the function. I didn't actually like call it the way that I expected. So I'm kind of glad I did that. I need the parentheses for the code in the function to run. And then it says, hey, I get this alert. Alert is like a keyword in JavaScript, kind of like a keyword, like you have keywords in Ruby, and it basically like puts up this little info box here. And I can say like, okay, great. And then yeah, the return value of an alert is undefined. Great. All right, let's do this your turn section. I'm not going to read it to you, but let's have y'all go through this. We'll take 10 minutes. Nope, we'll take 7 minutes. So 58 will be back. All right, I'd love to see what someone came up with, whether you did any of these bullet points would do, doesn't really matter. What you got. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. One of the best things about showing something that doesn't work is we'll figure out why. Let's go with Jahara.
I'd like you to help me fix it, please.
I could probably do that. Well, we could probably do that.
I'd like the collective you to help me fix it, please.
Yeah.
Let's.
Oh, I gotta stop. My bad. Stop.
Oh, I hadn't even figured out how to show my screen. Yep. Where did that go? There you are. Okay. Do we have code?
What do you mean?
Is my console up?
Oh yeah, I can see. I got you. Do you mind just making it full screen?
Sure. I don't know if that helped you.
It's pretty small.
Oh, it's getting bigger.
Yeah, there we go. Sweet. That looks better to me.
Okay, so what I did is I just first was rusty, but I finally declared variables as first name and last name. And then I used interpolation to write the name, and the alert works. And then I remembered that they needed to be camel cased, not snake cased. Oops. And then what I want to fix is I expected my random number to actually return a random number when I call it, and it doesn't, because I wanted to then put the random number in the right function so it'd call a random number.
I see. Yeah, okay, so a couple things going on here. So let's focus here on this let random number. So your function is working properly. You just haven't like declared a return value, and you didn't console log it. So basically like when you're calling it, it's getting invoked and it's running, but it's running kind of like behind the scenes. Like we don't have a way to see it at this point.
Then I need to.
Yeah, I think if you wrap it in a console log, then we should be able to like see something better. But yeah, that's like
And it's gonna want, even though I used let, it's gonna want another name, isn't it?
Let's see. I don't know.
It shouldn't, but okay.
I don't think it's. Oh yeah, I was gonna. I was leaning towards no, but I've been proven wrong so many times in this language that it's hard for me to have confidence.
Okay, there we go. So now with random number again, I should be able to alert. And then this needs to go outside of the backticks. String and concatenate, or just?
You can plus
Okay.
to do the concatenation. You can just use a plus sign, which is nice.
Backticks or regular string?
I'm not sure if you can do both backticks and regular string, but like we can try. JavaScript usually like in my experience just like works, but
The random number is, and I should be able to call random number again here.
correct.
And I need to interpolate this here. Yes.
Yes.
And it needs to be a function. And
That looks good to me.
I liked it because it was a let, not a const. And no,
It did alert, right?
it did, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do.
You know what? Do you know why? Because now we have the console log in it, and the console log is undefined. Like that's what's being returned from the function. So if we wanted it to work within another function, then we'd need it to be like, what do we need this to be? Either nothing, or you could say return to be more explicit. But yeah, now let's see if we can make it.
Redefine random number again. So I should just be able to call right.
Yeah. This is an interesting scope problem because I don't know if it's going to actually do it.
It's without the alert that's still up there. And I asked it to do that 3 times. Nope, we still get your random number, like your random number.
We see it.
Yeah, let me bring it back.
Cool. Yeah, so interesting. So I think it's like you ran into like a scope problem there. Or let's try this. Let's try returning like explicitly random number again.
And if I run the math.for/math.random inside of the let random number or inside of the right function, that would take care of all of my woes, yes?
I'm not sure what you mean by the right function.
No, so our function, right?
Oh,
If
yeah.
I was like number and then assign it the value of the math/math/random, that would solve all of this, I think.
Totally would, because then it would definitely like be within that scope. Yeah.
Oh no, look at us.
Okay, cool. So we can redefine it, which is nice. Yeah, that's an interesting one because what it looks like to me is basically in random number again without the return explicit, it's just like running that and then returning undefined like implicitly, which to be honest, like I wouldn't expect there. But like now when we say like, hey, explicitly return this line within my function, it does, which is interesting to me. But
Sweet.
something to note. All right, we got some hands. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if this console log is something that we're going to have to do, for everything, or is it only applicable when we're using the console to try stuff and test stuff?
Yeah, it's like a put statement basically. So it's like when you're using the console, but you can still use it like in if we were writing it in like a JavaScript file, right? And then we did console log, like it would print to the terminal then. So it's similar to puts. Cool. Aiden, go ahead.
Just looking at Jahara's, I think it was right method. I thought it was interesting that she could string interpolate first and last name without passing them as arguments. Like the scope is different. So when do you pass arguments?
You would usually want, like, in general, you would want to pass arguments, I would think, because then your function's more dynamic. Whereas that function that she wrote is dependent on first and last name already being defined, right? So that's like the difference there. So if you would have defined them as parameters and then passed them as arguments, now they can be passed it. Now you've said like this function always is going to need 2 arguments, and it's more dynamic because of that. And it's not reliant on something else being previously defined.
Okay. Thank you.
Totally. Jari, did you have something else?
Well, just based on what you said, then would it have been cleaner or better to make those locally defined variables inside of that function block? Or if I was going to like keep reusing them across the application, would it have been safer to just make them global variables? That way they could be changed whenever.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like I like to keep everything within the scope of a function like independent of anything outside of the scope of that function. Yet like this is one of my issues with JavaScript is like it can work so many different ways that like the rules are not clearly defined. There are a ton of opinions about the rules, but my opinion is like whatever you're going to do within a function, like I would have, for your case, defined first and last name within that function. So like define those variables within the scope of that function and then use them at will, however I needed to. And I think a better pattern than that is the one that I was telling Aiden, which is more dynamic, where it's like, hey, this function accepts arguments and, they can be passed in whenever, but we're always going to refer to those arguments because then I don't have to define anything. It's whatever, the invoker passed in. Yeah. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm just trying to catch up on where you decide to use or not use that little equal sign arrow thing, because on mine I wasn't doing that at all. It looked like Jahara was.
Yeah, it's like if you're defining it as like a constant function, so like if you're defining it as a function that won't change, then you define it that way, and that's just like the arrow function syntax is kind of what it is, but like you don't have to use that. I don't think so. Let's try out that theory. I'm not sharing. My bad. Nope. Okay, so I can't. So it's basically saying like anytime I want to define this function as like a function that needs to be like or cannot be changed, like I gotta give it this like arrow function syntax, which is basically like this. Am I doing it wrong? Probably. No, that looks okay. Unexpected end of input. Let's try and just do it as a single line, see if it likes that. Okay, it did like that, which is interesting to me. Maybe I screwed up something above and it was like, I don't know, clear. Okay, cool. This is this is the arrows talking about. This is what we should expect. I defined it as a constant above. So then I tried to redefine a function, a func, and I was not able to. And it looks like in the console, for whatever reason, like I'll just call this something else this time. A function. It looks like it likes the single line syntax to me. It wouldn't let me make a new line there, so that's interesting. But now if I call a func and invoke nothing happens because previously I defined it as an empty function, and then this one, a function, should print my name. And it does. Oh, JavaScript. Okay, Jahara, you have another question?
You got rid of the code I was going to ask you about when you cleared your console.
Damn it.
Right. So you defined a func in ES6 on your what we'll call line 1.
Mhm.
But if you had used the function keyword and just had function of func and then just given it the parentheses, can we change the value of that function, or does it have to be constant to be like, don't change it?
It has to be constant to be like, don't change it, but like, I don't even know if this will work. I don't think it will.
No, I meant like with the curly bracelet or with the open and close parentheses after my func. So if you get rid of like the fat arrow, yeah, if we open and close it
Mhm.
and then give it the curly braces like it wants, can then we later reassign the value of my func
Yep.
if we did it that way?
Yeah, you sure can. That's why we could do that. Remember how many times we reassigned my random int in like your example? The reason we were able to do that is because we defined it that way, where it was like, hey, this is malleable still.
Okay. The function is malleable but constant as well.
Correct. Okay, cool. Let's take a break, and then I want to maybe like talk about a couple other things, and then we'll get into the challenges. Yeah, we'll come back at let's come back at 20. All right, it's 11:20. Let's come back together. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like show y'all just the basic like conditional structure. Obviously, conditionals are going to be native to every language. They're just going to be like written a little differently. So this is the basics. It's like if, and then you actually have an expression on the same line as the if. Remember, in every language, the else will not evaluate any expression. I still see this in like some of your code here and there. Like there should never be like an expression next to an else. It's just basically like, hey, what runs if this is false? Like that's it. The other thing I wanted to talk about is like JavaScript uses triple equals to do like exact comparisons. There's also double equals in JavaScript, and like, how do I want to say this? It evaluates to true in situations you wouldn't expect it to. So we needed to use triple equals because it's just like the strict like, is this the exact match on the left and the right? So note that there is double equals in JavaScript. We don't use those. We use triple equals. Yeah, there's some examples here. That's nice. Yeah, I think like the best way to do this is just to get in. We kind of like got into some of this function stuff. I think like the function piece basically will have all of the syntax and examples to like get you to help you with writing your own functions. And then the other thing that I wanted to show you is just like how to run a JavaScript file. Let's get one that has a console log in it. This one looks good. Uh-oh, why is those called the same? Well, we'll see. All right. so I've named my file with a .js extension. And I'm going to put some things here, and I'm going to rename this one. Oh, I guess another thing I didn't really go over is like we use camel case in JavaScript because that's the convention. Camel case is like start with the lowercase, everything else is uppercase, essentially. Yeah, so let's call, add. Oh yeah, this is not going to work this way. So let's do this instead. I'm going to change this function around. And I'm going to do some stuff here. All right. Add another 2 numbers with this. Okay, cool. So what I expect to happen here, I've defined 2 functions. This one, the console log would never run because I'm returning this value ahead of it. Let's just demonstrate all of this. Add 2 numbers, and 1 and 2. And then similarly, we'll do 20. Or no, let's do 2 and 2. All right, so let's just kind of like walk through this. So for this first one, I'm basically never going to hit this console log statement because I've explicitly said, hey, return the value of these 2 numbers beforehand. Jeez, sorry, my fingers are like fat today. Okay. And then this next one is going to be a little different. I'm just console logging this to the screen, so I should be able to see that one. And I'm invoking both of them. So this one's going to run, then this one's going to run. Another thing to note is like there's these like semicolons, like essentially they're optional, but like and the convention differs on teams, but like in general, we use them in JavaScript to like basically say this is the end of one statement, and here's another statement, and this is the end of that statement. JavaScript. All right, so let's run this file by saying node example.js. Cool. All right, so what happened? Both functions were invoked. This one was first, so this function returned. This function ran and returned because I didn't like console anything to the screen. Let me put this up next to it. Because I didn't console anything to the screen, it just ran, and it returned before this console log boom runs. Then this next function ran, add another 2 numbers, and so this one, all I did was say like, yes, like actually print those, and then here you go. And then I used Node to run this example.js. Just make sure you have Node installed. You all should at this point. You can do it node-v to make sure. And Node is like the kind of like engine that you can run JavaScript with when you're just trying to like execute the file, similar to how you would do like Ruby and then the file name. Cool. Mike, what's up?
How come the function add 2 numbers didn't error out since you haven't defined what num1 and num2 are? Oh, you have. Sorry, line 10, never mind. Just ignore me.
No, you're good. You're good. I think like, yeah, it's let me hide these. Yeah, these parameters like are defined here, and so that's like what 1 and 2 become. But yeah, that I don't know, maybe hard to see there because of where my stuff was. So that's better. Yeah. Other questions about like writing stuff in the file? And if I wanted, say like I wanted this like console log boom to run, I would just not explicitly return, right? And then it would run. Okay, I want to give you all a chance. We're gonna do 2 like, actually there's probably not enough time for that. So let's do this. Let's spend 20 minutes, and I'd love for you to start with challenge 1 here. Don't worry about this, but start with challenge 1. It's basically, and if you reload the page, this kata word will go away, and sorry, that was like a typo from before. Write a function to convert a name into initials. So essentially the function should take a argument that is like a string with exactly one space in between that string, and then it should return to me a initial, or really some initials with exactly one dot, one period separating them. And yeah, you can see like it needs to also take into account if either of the names are inserted lowercase, the initials should still always come back uppercase. And then this one's a little bit spicier, to be honest. It's basically like how I would return, based on how many likes a certain post got, how I would display that information is kind of the idea here. So I need a function that takes in an array of any length, right? It could be one element in the array, it could be 100. And based on that array, I need to like return the first few values that are in the array as like, hey, like if there's none in there, if it's empty, no one likes it. If there's one, Peter likes this. If there's two, the two names like this. And then three, similar, it's following the similar pattern. Once I get above 3, now I need to do some work, which is basically say like how many others like this. And so you're gonna have to do some work with the length of the array here, because this number will change. Like the number 2 will change based on how many others there are in the array, right? So how long that array is. A little spicier. Questions on what I'm asking you to do? Go ahead, Joey.
Would you mind posting the node command you ran to run the file just in like the chat or something?
I sure can.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, cool. Yeah, let's take 20 minutes individually to work on this, and we'll come back at 51 and see what we came up with. Go ahead, Ryan.
All right. I did not get through both, but
I can't hear you, but can y'all hear him?
Yeah, I can hear him.
yeah.
Yes? Shit.
Okay, I'm not
It's
muted.
me then.
What about now?
Okay, you can talk.
Hopefully it's not me. You want me to, I can unplug. What about now?
Sorry about that. I still can't hear Ryan, but if y'all can hear him, I don't know, like maybe that's good. I'm gonna leave and rejoin.